Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Underscored Podcast. I am your host, Stephen Kent, Public Relations Manager and spokesperson for Young Voices. It's Friday, January 25th, TGIF. And man, is there so much going on. At the time of this podcast, the government has been closed for 34 days, 9 hours, 56 minutes, and 11 seconds. Thank you, CNN, for your highly dramatic count up clock. There is so much going on. Like I said, the government is closed. Our border debate is boiling over the surface in Congress. The President of the United States may use a state of emergency to enact his will on the border wall. Roger Stone, one of his personal advisors from his campaign years, is in handcuffs as of this morning, and Venezuela is nearing a state of revolution. So many possibilities, and I'm happy to be joined by Young Voices' Michael Shindler to talk about these things and more. Michael, welcome onto the podcast.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. You recently authored a piece I really enjoyed titled "A City on a Hill Needs Walls." It's in the American Conservative. It's a very enlightened point of view on the border wall debate that we are having in this country. And I want to talk to you a little bit about that here in just a minute. But we saw each other in Washington, D.C. this past week at LibertyCon. You took a good deal of interest in a lot of the speakers. Jeff Tucker had a pretty good speech on populism that you attended. What were your thoughts on some of the messages of LibertyCon and particularly the issue of populism at that conference?
I think that the issue of populism was one of the dividing variables at the conference amongst attendees. A lot of people weren't sure what to think of it, how to deal with it, whether or not it was on the whole a bad thing, a good thing, really what to make of it. I think that what makes the issue so interesting is that what populism is generally speaking an appeal to the people. And it's very hard to make an appeal to the people that is persuasive. When you talk about libertarian ideals, talk about market principles, talk about individual freedom, in order to sound convincing, you usually have to delve down into philosophy. Whereas a lot of people say, who are making plainly or merely like nationalist appeals or merely like welfare-oriented appeals, don't have to do that because these proposals are on their face convincing.
Do you sort of sense that the libertarian movement, I've always sort of viewed them as being very skeptical of populism, not caring too much for things like mass appeal, broad will of the people. But do you sort of sense that there is a desire within the movement to move in those directions to try to figure out how to deal with this moment in time that we're at?
I think that there is both a desire in part of the movement, but more than a desire, there is a necessity. Because without making a mass appeal, when your opponents or when other people in the political arena are making those mass appeals, then you're going to lose out. We live in a democratic republic, and in order to make policy in that democratic republic, you need to make an appeal to the people. And one of the ways you can do that is using all the tools within the populist toolkit. A lot of libertarians are skeptical of that toolkit because they've seen what's been used to do. But one must remember that those things are merely tools. They're not the substance of what you make itself.
Yeah. Michael, kind of backing up here just a little bit, like I was sort of mentioning earlier, there's so much going on and there's so much I'd like to talk to you about. But, we really have sort of the peak of a Shakespearean drama playing out right now here in D.C., both with negotiations, if you want to call them that, between Nancy Pelosi and Donald Trump, and also with the arrest of Roger Stone this morning. Do you think that this counts as possibly good material for a future Broadway play? This is some high drama.
I do think so. In fact, before we started talking, I was watching Nixon in China, the opera by John Adams. And I think that what's going on right now makes for far better opera and far better drama than the stuff of that opera, even though that was great stuff. Like what we have now, this is history in the making. Like we're living in the midst of history, and it's absolutely fantastic. Perhaps not everything that's happening is fantastic, but it's fantastic to live in the midst of this, like to be alive at a time when so many things are changing, when so many precedents are being overturned. I think that this does have the making of great drama.
You write in The American Conservative, like blood-soaked characters out of a Greek epic, President Donald Trump and House Speaker Nancy Pelosi are engaged in a titanic battle of wills that's enthralled the nation, shut down the government, and stymied Congress, all over funding for a fancy fence. You go on to say that this is not really about the wall. It's about something much deeper. Could you talk to me and listeners a little bit about what you view this debate as really being about?
What this debate is, I think, is mostly about what we are as a nation, what we've become. It's worth pointing out as listeners that we already do have along a great deal of the border a big concrete wall for hundreds of miles built during the Clinton administration. Yet, it's very telling that during the Clinton administration, they were very, very reluctant to call that structure a wall. Instead, one PR functionary at the time called it a fence, and he said that's because wall has a negative connotation. And yet, for anyone who looked at it, it was quite plain. It was a wall. So what's going on? Well, I think what's going on is that we recognize that like the nation has like definite borders, boundaries that like in order to live and to understand where we are and what we are, we have to mark with a physical monument. Now, of course,
Well, this is relatively new, and I think you point this out. Like we've never really been, as a country, at the point where we've sort of realized the ends of our borders, the end of our sort of territory. The United States is a young republic, and we're even younger in the fact that we have sort of finished our expansion. Um, why do you think that plays a role into sort of national discontent?
I think that it plays a role in national discontent because it changes what people understand their citizenship in the nation to be. If one day you thought of yourself as a pioneer, an adventurer, as someone who as someone plowing through the unknown, and making discovering, and the next day you were told that no, you're not a pioneer, you're not an adventurer, you're a citizen of a mature republic, and you have definite responsibilities to things that already exist, that the maps have already been detailed, then you might understandably be a bit frustrated.
So why do you think that needs to be sort of a thing that we need to give credence to or to give into? Because you've spoken about some of the validity of the populist moment, and you've also talked about how, this national discontent, this little bit of crisis of identity about what it means to be an American in a fully globalized era, um, sort of necessitates that we think of ourselves as a city on the hill and that we might need walls. I'm not very favorable towards the wall. I don't think it's your natural instinct either. But you sort of make a soft case here in this piece that I think is worth looking at. Do you think that it's worth giving into these calls for a border wall?
I think that it's worth giving into because the cost isn't dramatically high. In fact, it's a drop in the bucket compared to like how much we spend on foreign aid or how much we spend on like one or two of the 800 like military bases that we have abroad. Two, I think that it reifies in concrete or steel slats or whatever they make it out of what we've become. At every milestone in our nation's history, like we usually, to mark that development, to mark our growth as a nation, build. Sometimes we build beautiful things like the Lincoln Memorial or the Washington Monument. And sometimes we build less beautiful but functional things like the highway system that sprawls throughout the country. After the end of World War II, when nationalism was at its height, when we had a coherent identity and when our borders were really well defined, when we decided that, we may be in West Germany, we may have effectively conquered Europe, but we're going to give it back to the Europeans because that's not ours. That's when we put up the first substantial physical barrier on the border. It marks our limits, the end of who we are, where we stop.
But do you
And
think
it
that that's
reminds
the
us.
most optimistic version of who we are going into the 21st century? We have only grown into globalism, sort of these broad international forms of governance that extend across borders. It has made people uncomfortable, and you rightly point out that this is sort of what we're seeing in Europe and what we're seeing in the U.S. If you offer sort of a charitable view of it, is a sort of panic about the status of the nation state going into the 21st century. Do you think that the nation state is just absolutely this thing worth preserving, or do you think that building this wall and these sorts of projects that are emotional in this way are actually what we need to be doing? Because I would sort of expect that you would be skeptical of emotional pulls such as this one.
Well, nations are, in large part, emotional things. They help to regulate the way that we feel about the world. I'm not like a fan of global governance. I don't think it's one that's very accountable to the people who live under its governance.
That's
I
true.
am
That's true.
I am a larger fan of nation states that really do represent the wills of their particular nations. Peoples generally are different. They have different wills, different ways of life. The things that we value most, our liberties, our freedoms, these are things that come from our national identity. We were a project, a very, very unique project early on in our national development to, as I say in the article, root the rarefied ideals of the Enlightenment in real soil. Most countries didn't do that. Those countries weren't made for that purpose. But our country was was basically crafted by a bunch of political theorists, mostly, to do exactly that. That is, in part, what our nation is, and that's something not worth. I think that's something that one shouldn't scoff at. So I do support this. I do support things that bolster national identity, things that preserve exactly those freedoms, those liberties, in our way of life, which are worth preserving.
Where does that go awry, though? The 20th century was characterized by a hyper focus on national identity. We often just sort of offhand say nationalism, and it led to some of the worst conflicts in human history that we have seen. Where does sort of this return to a focus on national identity, the nation state, go in our own century, and how can we have it avoid mass loss, military conflict, and destruction of human life and prosperity?
I think that's an excellent question, but I think that part of the question can be answered by focusing on exactly the 20th century, on exactly that giant tragedy. During that time, nation states came into their own, and the idea of a nation as the focal point of national labor and national thought was accelerated. And you saw different national characters come to their full fruition. Germany's national character, it turns out, is a pretty destructive thing when you combine romanticism and German idealism, and Prussian efficiency. The end result is concentration camps. In Italy, the end result was Italian fascism. But if you did that in England, then they did. The end result wasn't, the evils of Nazism or the horrors of Italian fascism, but it was a monarchical republic that we still find quite good today, that we find quite respectful. The same thing happened in the U.S. Under FDR. We became highly nationalistic, and we developed the most coherent sense of national identity that we ever had up to that point, and perhaps ever had. But what happened wasn't concentration camps. What happened wasn't fascist horror. What happened was an emboldened America, one that produced, I think, some of the most beautiful and characteristic American architecture and literature and poetry that we had. That we have perhaps ever had, and that was better than what we had previously.
I do think skeptics of American interventionism and expansion abroad would take issue with some of that, but we'll leave that for another time. Michael, you kind of wrap up in your piece. You write, Sigmund Freud once advised a friend, being entirely honest with oneself is a good exercise. So for a moment, let's all be honest with ourselves. The wall would improve border security, but this hullabaloo isn't about border security. It's the adolescent howling of a country that's just emerged from its youth. I love that. Always a pleasure to read your latest in the American Conservative, Michael. Taking us out of the realm of the fiction, of the non-fictional, let's talk a little bit more drama. You've said some very kind of lofty and Shakespearean things about the drama between Michael Cohen, Donald Trump, sort of his inner circle, as they have all been falling prey to Bob Mueller. Now with Roger Stone in handcuffs under indictment. What would you do if you just, were writing a play and you were trying to make this as dramatic as possible, as tragic as possible? What would happen next in the realm of Michael Schindler fiction for the Donald Trump and Inner Circle 2016 drama?
Well, if I were writing a play perfectly for exciting sake of drama, I might give Trump a national emergency on the day of the scheduled SOTU address. I think that would be the most dramatic turn of events possible. Like, yeah, really, bring the whole drama to like a real point of the point of absolute tension, and that's, I think, one way that you can achieve it.
Well, I'm a Star Wars guy, and I seem to recall the walls closing in around a Chancellor Palpatine, and then the Jedi hand him a national emergency in the form of a accidental coup, and things do not end well for the Democratic Republic. Michael Schindler, thank you so much for coming on Underscored today. You can follow Michael Schindler on Twitter at Michael Schindler. Lots of great takes that you need to see there. We'll be back next week with another episode of Underscored. Until then, stay free.